The following podcast is an Embassy Row production.
Hey everybody, I'm Marc Lamont Hill, owner of Uncle Boobies Coffee and Books. I am a professor, a scholar, and most importantly, a book nerd. I say book nerd because I don't just love to read books, I'm the person who loves to read about the book. I love hearing authors talk about how and why they wrote the book, and I love talking to other book nerds about their favorite books. That's why I started Coffee and Books. It's a podcast all about books. Every episode, I sit down over a cup of coffee with the world's biggest authors to discuss the most interesting, controversial, fun, and important books. Sometimes I hang out with experts, fans, and other special guests to talk about some of the greatest books of all time. And this week is no different. November 17, 2020 is going to go down as one of the big publishing moments in American history. President Barack Obama released his memoir, A Promised Land, and they pre-printed millions of copies because they knew that Americans were going to buy this book. In fact, everybody in the world nearly, it felt like, was going to buy this book. And I wanted to have an episode where we talked about this book, both the content of it and its significance to the publishing industry. And I reached out to President Obama, and he hasn't gotten back to me yet. So I'm going to assume he's not. So instead, I brought in people who are just as dope. Not quite as famous, but just as dope. I'm bringing in Avisa Gallman. She is the bookstore manager at Uncle Boobies Coffee and Books. I'm also bringing in Justin Moore. He is the general manager of Uncle Boobies Coffee and Books. And I'm bringing in Nate Marshall. He is assistant professor of English at Colorado College, and he is the author of a brilliant new book of poems. It's called Finna. And I want to thank all of you for joining me for this conversation. Good to see y'all.
Hey, Mark.
Good to see you too, Mark. Hey.
What's up?
Before we get started talking about this book, y'all, I want to ask you, as we always do, what you are drinking. I am currently drinking a very, very, very strong cup of black coffee with nothing mixed in it. I've been on book tour. I'm tired. I don't want to go too strong with the espresso because it'll keep me up all night. I don't want to go too weak with just the water. So I'm doing a nice 2-cup-a-day black coffee in my world. What are y'all drinking? Visa, what you drinking?
I just brought home a cup of Uncle Bobby's standard drip with a little bit of hazelnut flavoring.
Nice. See, at home, I thought the hazelnut might be replaced by like rum or vodka or something like that. Little Baileys. Okay.
Don't tell all my secrets.
All right, that's fair. Justin, how about you? What you drinking?
Well, Mark, I have to always be the contrarian here, and I know this is Coffee and Books, but I am having a lavender hot chocolate from Uncle Bobby's.
Ooh, that actually sounds good. It's super, super cold. Our producer, Karis, was torturing us with his 80-degree LA weather. And since we're freezing over here in Philly, that lavender hot chocolate actually sounds good. Now, Nate, you in a cold place too. So what you over there doing?
Well, so this is the thing. Colorado is actually not that. It's like 60 degrees, so it's pretty good right now. Yeah, sorry.
That ain't hot chocolate cold.
It's also very sunny.
Oh my God, yeah. You ruining my. So what you drinking in? Is that just some Earl Grey or something?
So I'm drinking a white tea, which has a little bit of caffeine, but not like too much to peak me too hard.
Got you. See, that's the drink of an organized person. That means that you get enough energy to get through your day and write, but you go to bed at a responsible time. Is that the right interpretation of your tea drinking habits?
I just have a natural wellspring of energy. I don't know.
Wow, I'll take it. I wish I had that. Well, look, let's talk about this book because it's super, super interesting to me. Avisa, as a bookstore manager, you watch the trends and patterns in a store. And I was in Uncle Bobby's myself yesterday and today. And if I had any self-esteem, by the way, there's a promo for my book on one corner and there's a promo for Obama's on the other. Not only does his poster make me look like a troll, but the lines of people buying his book in my store is extraordinary. I ain't mad, I ain't hating, but I did notice it. What do you see it?
Well, first there was a lot of buzz before the book even came out. People were calling, trying to get their hands on this book, and we were under strict instruction. We can't even look at this book until midnight on November 17th.
Wow.
Ever since, it's the stacks that we've had and then display are just lower and lower every day.
It's really impressive. And you mentioned that because there's a publication date for a book and there's also a street date for a book. And sometimes books have different publication dates than their street dates. But the high-end, super, super fancy, super, super prestigious books, they make sure that the street date is the same as the pub date. They don't want that book leaking. It's like back in the day when we would stand in front of Tower Records trying to buy music, and you couldn't buy it, that Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, till 11:59 and 59 seconds, and then 1 second later you could walk in the store and get it. That's how they treated the Obama book. And you're right. I mean, the pre-orders were crazy. People were coming in. And what kind of people are you seeing buying this book?
Really, all kinds of people. The variety of different people that come to our stores. We've had, parents, just younger people, student who look like students. A lot of our regulars.
It's a range. When was the last time you saw a book get this kind of attention, like in terms of like retail attention?
I almost want to say that the Obamas are always just this incomparable sale. So I'm thinking back to Becoming.
Michelle Obama's memoir.
Yes.
I think that might be right. And again, independent bookstores, and especially Black independent bookstores, a lot of our lights stayed on. There's a lot of people around this country whose lights stayed on because of Michelle Obama. You talk about Black women saving us. Man, when Michelle Obama came through, people would come through buying 2 and 3. People were buying them for birthday presents, Christmas gifts, Kwanzaa gifts, Thanksgiving conversation pieces, coffee tables. I mean, bookstores that would normally maybe have 100 transactions, we're now having 200 transactions in a day. Those who were selling 50 books a day were now selling 90 books in a day. And those differences, those margins make a huge difference for independent bookstores. So, and I think you're right. I mean, the racial diversity of it is very interesting. For Michelle Obama, obviously a whole bunch of Black women bought it, but a cross-section of our demographic purchased it. When you look at the Obama demographics of who's buying the book, do you see it as different? I should say Barack Obama's to Michelle Obama's.
I think I have been surprised to see as strong numbers of all kinds of white people of all ages buying the Obama book, Barack's book this time. Yeah, as opposed to the older Black women who came out strong for Michelle Obama's.
I think that's interesting. Yeah, I think Black women have been supportive of the Obamas, period. And they're coming to the store buying it in large numbers. And anecdotally, what I'm seeing for Barack Obama's book is the same. The Black women are coming in and buying the book, whereas women will buy both. I think a lot of men are buying the Barack Obama book at a higher rate, which isn't surprising, I guess, given gendered purchasing patterns.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting to see that when people come in, they don't even look at the price unless they looked it up beforehand. They're just, coming in and grabbing it and going to the register.
Woo, must be nice. That's an interesting observation. Obama books tend to do that. I remember when Pete Souza had his book of photographs of Obama, it was the same thing. People said, I want the Obama photograph book. And that book was hard to buy. It was hard to find. We couldn't keep it in the store. I tried to order 100 a day, like we give you 10. And it was because people just love to have collections of the Obamas. And the photograph book, the Pete Souza book, was extraordinary. There were some others, and people would buy that if they couldn't get the Pete Souza book. People want Obama stuff, and people aren't asking how much. And the book is $45, which is a lot for a hardback book to come out. I mean, obviously, it's a 700-pager. There's printing costs. I'm not shocked by the cost. It's something else. Justin, let me bring you into this as well, because again, we're talking about the high volume of sales. And of course, Uncle Bobby's is blessed to have a cross range of customers, and we sell a decent number of books. But this is still a big deal. What does a book like Obama's A Promised Land mean for bookstores, for independent bookstores, for Black bookstores?
The best, kind of metaphor that I can give currently is what's happening, and I guess in like electronic stores with this PlayStation 5, right? Where you have this item that is just kind of taken over like the airways and social media, and everyone's talking about it. There's a release date, everyone's getting excited about it. And then as a retailer, you just make sure you have it stocked, you get your displays ready. It's like an all hands on deck kind of experience, and it just kind of dominates the operations internally for a few weeks. And you just get excited about it because there's very few sure things in business, and particularly retail. And you just know that a release like Barack's memoir is going to bring people into the store, which means, they're going to look at your other merch. They're going to look at other books. They're going to look, they're going to get a coffee. So it's just going to bring an enormous amount of business into the store. So, it's a very exciting time if you're a bookstore, because you just know there's going to be this guaranteed rush of customers and rush of business, which almost never happens. Like the last time it happened, like we just kind of talked about, is when his lovely wife forever, Flotus, wrote her memoir.
Absolutely. And again, that price tag, $45, of course, it's due to the size. It's a 768-page book. Is usually something that at least make you blink as a customer, but it seems like it's not dissuading anybody from buying it.
That's correct. I think that has a lot to do with the Obama brand, right? I think people will blindly support the Obamas. And I don't say blindly as a pejorative. I think it's just the amount of pride and admiration that, folks have for the Obama family and his presidency. I think particularly in hindsight, if you really disliked the last 4 years and the current president, it almost makes you kind of yearn for the Obama presidency even more. So kind of getting this book is almost like having another slice of that 2008 to 2016 kind of, lived experience that that nostalgia that you really enjoyed.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things that, and I hope I'm not talking out of school here, one of the things that you texted to me, and I didn't even realize it the other day, you were looking at the price of the book on Amazon. And, I'm not here to just beat up on Amazon, but, it's easy and it's necessary. But they're selling the book for $27. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because a lot of people talk about independent bookstores and how they thrive and why they thrive and why they fail. But one of the things that people don't seem to get is that it's not just about individual choices. It's not like every independent bookstore that fails is just irresponsible with money or isn't making good business decisions. They have this hulking presence of Amazon behind them. What does it mean for Amazon to be selling this book that the rest of us are selling for $45, for them to be selling it for $27?
One, it shows that Amazon does not care who thrives and survives in business. Being able to sell a book like that with the kind of popularity, like I just spoke to, like all indie bookstores are experiencing this kind of rush, and it's the kind of income we all need to get through the rest of the year. So for Amazon to kind of undercut prices to such a degree, further kind of reflects their history of putting small businesses out of business. And it also shows, I don't know any small business that's able to invest in a product that they don't have to make money on. So for Amazon
Right.
to be able to sell a product that they don't actually have to make money on shows, well, if you're making all this money anyway, how are you still coming up with these margins if you're able to sell a product that's going to sell a lot of units and make no money off that investment? I don't know how that works. I mean, I guess if we cut our own workforce by 50%, we could probably afford to sell the book cheaper, but we don't like to operate that like that at Uncle Bobby's. But it's kind of what's going on in our country with this economic inequality that's not just on a personal level, but on a corporate level. And that's stealing a lot of sales away from local indie bookstores, because there's people who may have wanted to buy it from an Uncle Bobby's or a Lit Bar or Greenlight or any of these other bookstores around the country. But then they see that price tag on Amazon, and, in a pandemic, $20 can mean the difference between groceries or not.
That's exactly right.
And it's hard to fault someone. It more speaks to Amazon and the ruthlessness of their business practices than, any individual consumer's decision at that point when you're cutting it by that much money.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, Amazon does this all the time, but normally a hardback is $19 or $25. And so if we're selling it for $25 and someone else is selling, and Amazon is selling it for $22 or even $20, a person will say, I can save $5. I can spend the $5 to support the mom and pop. But when you're asking somebody to pay almost twice as much for the book in order to support an independent bookstore, I don't blame a customer that can't make that choice. Now, again, I hope that customers make the best choice that they can. And those who have the means, I hope they recognize the importance of supporting independent bookstores. And of course, Bookshop was one of those sort of big companies. It's an emergent company that is growing to kind of fight Amazon and support independent bookstores. 30% of all their revenue goes to independent bookstores, and a lot of independent bookstores are connected to Bookshop. So if you want to buy the book and not support Amazon, you can go to bookshop.org and purchase that book and any other book. And if you go to bookshop.org/shop/Uncle Bobby's, or just search for Uncle Bobby's when you get to the Bookshop website, you can support Uncle Bobby's in particular and independent bookstores more broadly. But as I talked about in my new book, We Still Here, this is part of Amazon's beachhead strategy. You come in, you corner a market. Remember in the good old days, they just wanted to be the world's biggest bookstore.
Yes.
And then they became the world's biggest bookstore by shutting everybody down. And then they cornered another market. Now they're the world's biggest vendor of everything almost. And this is part of a bigger strategy. And so the Obama book, in many ways, is representative of the crisis and the possibility of the independent bookstore, right? We get these gems and we get to have book clubs and conversations and meetings, and we get to do all kinds of stuff with this book. But a lot of folk will come into our bookstore or another independent bookstore, see the book, love the cover, love the artwork, and then go on their phone and have it one day shipped to them from Amazon because they can't afford to pay twice as much for it or 80% more for it. And it's an interesting thing, but I'm excited about this book in general. And that's why I want to turn to Nate Marshall to talk about some of the content of this book, because I don't want to just have the kind of big picture structural thing. I want to actually talk about what this book means. So Nate, presidential memoirs are a very particular thing. Would it be wrong to say that they're as much public relations as they are an accurate assessment of their history?
Oh, absolutely. I think in the modern moment, they're in some ways more public relations, right? Especially with, with Obama and, whatever Donald Trump will do after office. But, these are folks who we're following day to day with a 24-hour news cycle and with the benefit of social media. And so, we don't really need to be reminded of what happened, but it's a kind of, it's sort of their take on it, right? It's them getting a word in edgewise, right? Like the old Southern folks would say.
It's an interesting thing. I mean, there's a way to think about it as this is their take on the past. This is their take over their tenure. I think Benghazi was this. I think Jeremiah Wright was that. There's another way to think about legacy, and that presidents are keenly conscious of their legacy, and they see their memoir as an attempt not to offer their point of view, but to actually rewrite, to very intentionally articulate a version of their tenure that's different than maybe the dominant narrative, and hoping that that one takes. I mean, or is that too cynical to read?
No, I mean, I think that that's fair. I was sort of thinking about it as I was reading and taking notes and writing my review. I thought about the way that this is maybe not for us, but it's for, our children or our grandchildren, right? It's for the scholars that are going to come after. And every single scholar that writes a book that is about Obama or that deals with Obama significantly, they're going to have to go to this book first.
I mean, that's a hefty responsibility. This one came out 4 years after the president's tenure is over. It's released right after Joe Biden defeats Donald Trump. It's an interesting moment for this book to come out, right? And it'd be interesting to think about how this book would have been received in the era of a second Trump presidency.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I mean, I thought about that too, right? Because the Tribune, when they reached out to me about doing the review, potentially, I got to be honest, I don't know if I would have done it if the election had turned out differently, or say if we were still unsure. I don't know. I mean, one, I think it's probably true of me and a lot of us that I would maybe just be in a different emotional, intellectual place in terms of thinking about the world and the work. And certainly if the election were still in some way contested in a widespread way, right, I should say, then I would be really thoughtful about like, okay, I don't want to put my thumb on the scale in a way that could embolden or empower Trump, right? Like, I don't know if this is a review, quite frankly, I would have written in mid-October, right? In the way I would have written in mid-November.
There seems to be a pressure on Barack Obama's memoir that might not be on others, particularly as a written text. Dreams of My Father was a critically acclaimed bestseller before he ever mounts a run, right, for the presidency. The Audacity of Hope is clearly a campaign book, right? That's a book that you write once you're trying to be president or make a serious run for national power. Again, well received. According to all accounts, Barack Obama is writing these books himself. According to all accounts, he wrote this book himself. As a writerly text, I'm thinking about what it means to write your own book. No one expects Donald Trump to write his own book, right? No one expects the Clintons to write their own book. They're all going to get help. That's an ordinary process. But Obama is sitting down as a scholar and as a writer and saying, I'm going to make my own story. I mean, does that create a different pressure?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does. And certainly, like, he kind of unintentionally threw Michelle under the bus a while back when he told her, or someone was asking why your book's taking so long. And he's like, well, I'm actually writing mine.
Right. He said, Michelle had a ghostwriter. I'm writing mine.
Right. And so, I think, it does create a different kind of context, right? And also, like, he's the president, right? Which is different than Michelle's book. But he's the president. He's someone who has a reputation as a competent, as an able writer. And he's also, I think, someone who has a reputation, both earned and maybe not unearned, about being an excellent communicator, right? And so we're always reading everything that he does in the light of that, right? Like, we don't expect Donald Trump to be cogent or coherent or truthful or anything, but we do have some expectation of how Obama will communicate, how his communication will pan out.
Look, 768 pages is a long way to go if the writing ain't compelling. We'll get to the content, but just from a writing perspective, is this a compelling text?
I think it's compelling at points. My bias is I'm a poet, and so I love something to be as short as it can be, and I don't feel like he accomplished that. But there certainly are points where he's offering insights. He's, giving a little bit of behind the scenes, maybe about the inner workings of him and Michelle's marriage, or about certain things that have played out in the White House. And yeah, those things are compelling. They have stakes that we are all interested in and that we that touch us all, right? American or not, like across the world.
When I think about the period, this is supposed to be part of a 2-volume set, right? This is the first of 2 volumes from President Obama. What's the territory that he's covering in the first book?
He does a kind of drive-by of his early days, right? His sort of, the story that we all know. I've come from people that are Kansans and Kenyans or whatever, right? He does a drive-by of that sort of through college and all that. And, we get the beginnings of his political career, and we stop the book right at the killing of Osama bin Laden, which I think was a sort of smart place to stop if you're going to cut this book in half, right? Because it is, I think, narratively a strong place to end, but it also does that legacy work of reminding us, oh, right, this is the dude that killed Osama bin Laden. He gets credit for that, whatever that means.
Right, I was going to say, and for some, that's the reason why he's a serious president and the reason why he's a great statesman. And then for others, it's oh, yeah, this is that imperial neoliberal presidency that, gets kind of tucked away under the fragrances of hope and change. And quite frankly, just not being Donald Trump at this point.
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing. And let's be honest, in your Chicago Tribune review of the book, it wasn't the most generous read of the book, and some people have actually pushed back against your critique and almost made it sound like you were hating. I actually thought it was a compelling and insightful review, but some people pushed back. What was your major critique with the text?
I think one of the things is a little bit that I think it loses steam from being so long. I also think that in some ways my critique of the text is somewhat my critique of the president, right? In that I think that this was sometimes a president who was too willing to hedge than to sort of decide what he believed, even if they weren't winning arguments or even if they weren't things that folks agreed with, right? I think this sort of tendency to overconsider is one of the things that makes a text too long and is one of the things that loses steam, just speaking purely as a matter of literature, right? Not even talking about whatever policy implications that has.
There are some moments here that I thought were interesting. You said the Obama that shines through the text is certainly brilliant and analytical, but with little philosophical or ideological heft. That's a strong claim there. Tell me why you say that.
Yeah, well, first off, you got to make some strong claims. But in terms of the ideological piece, it's sort of what I said before. I think that this was a president and in some ways a writer who, is a bit unwilling to say look, I think I should have done this or to appraise things in certain ways.
Yeah.
And I think that works not only to his detriment as a leader, but also to his detriment as a crafter of a narrative. But the philosophical piece, at least as I see it, is he has a tendency, right? And it is this sort of kind of centrist, liberal, American consensus tendency to be dismissive, right? To either be dismissive or to misread certain texts either intentionally or unintentionally, right? So there's a point where he brings up W.B. Du Bois in the text, right? Which kind of shocked me because when I think of Barack Obama, I do not think of W.B. Du Bois for a bunch of reasons.
I think that's a fair take, right? He ate Du Bois.
Yeah, right. And that's fine. He doesn't have to be, right? Du Bois would have been a terrible, politician for a lot of reasons. But he does this, this reading of, one of the sort of, one of the kind of foundational concepts for anyone that has done some study of Du Bois, and he misreads it. He whiffs.
You're talking about double consciousness, by the way, which is for the audience that comes up. Double consciousness, of course, is a key, as you said, intellectual kind of concept advanced by W.B. Du Bois in his 1903 classic text, The Souls of Black Folk. Yeah, talk about that a little bit.
Right. And so when he brings up double consciousness, right, and it's a part that stands out, right, in the book, we get some space and then Du Bois starts the paragraph, right? And so we get a sense we're in a new section. We get a literal section break. But he brings up double consciousness and he talks about it in this way that sort of boils it down to this notion that Black Americans feel like perpetual outsiders or feel like not American, right? Which is not at all what Du Bois is saying.
Right.
And for me, right, and this is, my own biases as I think a reader and also a, educator, is that if any student brought a reading like that into my class, I would say similar things that I said about Obama's reading, right? And that doesn't disqualify other things that he said in the text, but it is a serious misunderstanding, right? And it's a misunderstanding that in some ways we see play out again and again across Obama's understanding of race and identity, right? The way that even going back to like the Jeremiah Wright speech, both as it happened and how he sort of frames it in the book, he has this real tendency to make these sort of what I read as false equivalencies between, say, his grandmother's fear of a black man panhandling and Jeremiah Wright's, sort of beliefs about the dangers of white supremacy. And that false equivalency is incredibly dangerous, right? And it also is really foundational to the American misunderstanding of race. And so it feels to me important to point out, especially when he just takes one of our great scholars, takes one of our foundational scholars in the space of, Black thought and Black studies in this country and just so willfully misreads him, right?
Why do you assume that it's willful and not just a bad read?
I don't know if it's willful or not, but I think but that to me is less important, right? The fact that Barack Obama doesn't understand sort of, at least in this way, this sort of fundamental concept of understanding race and racism in this country as a relationship of power. And he often boils it down to a kind of simple misunderstanding or this kind of both sidesism, feels exceptionally dangerous to me, regardless of its sort of intent.
And that's an important thing to think about with this book is that, these books are often, they don't just advance a politics, they also reflect a certain kind of politics. And there's a way that Obama throughout his presidency has always tried to establish equivalency. There's pain on both sides argument after Ferguson or wherever. And this focus on sameness, all Americans have the same values, all Americans want the same things, that maybe understates the power and the intractability of white supremacy in this country. And so I like you, I think about whether, and I wrestle with personally, whether Obama is cynically trying to advance this project at post-presidency, which he certainly doesn't have to do, right? Jimmy Carter certainly moved to the left after his presidency, right? Or if this is just who Obama is, if this is not yet another example of us projecting like a green screen onto Barack Obama, wanting him to be more left-wing than he is, wanting him to be more progressive than he is, and that he might just be somebody who really believes in this American project, who really has a sort of left-center view, not a left view, and it kind of just is what it is, and the book is just a living document of that.
Yeah, I think I tend to that reading, right, which is why I sort of step back from characterizing that as willful. But, I don't know, that concerns me on some levels, or at least I want to point out what are the limitations of that kind of thinking, right? Like there's this thing that's been sort of circulating around some corners of the internet. There's a piece earlier in the book when he's talking about being in college and reading certain thinkers, so reading Marx or reading, various folks because of like the women he was interested in, right? And he does this like little pithy thing that I understand is like a writerly technique of boiling folks down to a few things, right? So like the long-legged socialist or the ethereal bisexual who wore all black or whatever, right? But I think that I always notice that he has a tendency to do that with views that are left of him, with views that are more progressive than him in a way that he does not do with views that are more conservative to him or views that he shares, right? And that is first fundamentally like dismissive and sort of intellectually dishonest. I think that often that is the kind of American political mainstream's way of dealing with political thought. And I think it is really dangerous. It's like to our detriment, right? Like we all suffer because of that, because we don't take ideas seriously, right? In the same way that he recognizes because he got chastised, and he writes about this in the book, when he said people, cling to their guns and their God or whatever, right? Their Bibles and their guns or whatever it was. And so he understood that there was a kind of penalty for essentializing a certain sect of American life, right? Whatever we think about that. But he never really has to contend with that with the left, and specifically with Black folks on the left. And that bothers me. And I say that as someone who voted for Obama twice, who literally worked on his like early campaigns, right? Like the Senate primary as a kid, was going door to door with stuff, and who in some ways like still has a lot of affection or interest or whatever. Like I do feel still some investment in this president after all of this, but I don't think investment strips me from the ability to like be thoughtfully critical, especially not about the text, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let me circle back to something you said earlier. I was thinking about when you said that there's a way that Obama doesn't sufficiently maybe account for mistakes, or doesn't sufficiently move outside of the kind of political posturing of saying, I messed this up, or, I could have done this differently, and that it becomes somewhat surface. How much of that is just a limitation of the genres? I was thinking about like when you write a letter of recommendation for somebody, right? Like, you're not supposed to really criticize the person, right? I would never write a letter for grad school for somebody and say, yeah, they're a brilliant student. They need to work on their writing. They need a little more discipline, but they'll be great, because no one else does that, right? That's not the genre. And so if I do that, it gets read as me actually not wanting the person, because I'd be giving the honest American, as opposed to British, letter of recommendation. Is there something about the genre of presidential memoirs that makes it impossible to have that kind of self-critique because of what the others have done, what the Clintons have done, what the Bushes have done, et cetera?
Yeah, I think absolutely, right? But, in some ways, this is perhaps a foolish hope, right? But again, like I read Obama's first book, probably first when I was in high school and again in college, and admire that book a lot. Like a lot of my reading is rereading, quite frankly. And I admire that book a lot, in part because of how it not only like tells a story or tells the narrative of a life, but also does some useful thought work reflecting on those things. And so I think, me and perhaps other people had a sort of foolish hope that maybe this president could buck some of those trends, right? And that is, and this is maybe like the double bind of being a president that has a reputation as a great writer, right? Which most don't.
Right.
But the presidential memoir, like as we think about it contemporarily, is this thing. It is this sort of defensive thing of like, not that you never admit like, oh, we got this wrong, or oh, we lost here, right? Because that does happen in the book, and that does happen across many of these books, but it is a kind of legacy project, right? And so it's less reflective than like a typical memoir, than say like, the book Heavy, which I admire a lot, or even The Light of the World by Elizabeth Alexander, any number of memoir, The Beautiful Struggle by Ta-Nehisi Coates, like all of these things, right? It doesn't do that kind of thought work, but also, those people have a different relationship to like power and what they say and what people are thinking about what they say. And so I understand it, but I think it's a loss. Right?
Absolutely. And when I think about the great presidential memoirs, I think that this may end up sitting right near the top just because of, it's a fairly low bar. Are there any presidential memoirs that for you are exemplars of what's possible, either as from a writerly perspective or from their attention to the content?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think this one will probably like stand up in that way, in part because he's not the only person to do 2 volumes. Like I believe Dwight Eisenhower did 2 as well.
Yes.
And a few other folks have, but I do think that this one will stand up because one, like he's a decent prose stylist, right? He can write like for real. And 2, because I think the benefit of doing 2 volumes is you can get a bit of a sense of the reaction, the response, and think about what you want to do differently. And like I said, like this is a president who thinks very deeply. And so I think we'll try to improve in the second piece, particularly because I think, the second piece, because it's going to cover the end of his time in office and the rise of Trump and all that.
Yes.
Yeah, he's going to have to be more reflective, and that's going to be really interesting. So I'm actually like, I'm excited for that book in a way that I feel less excitement towards this one. But to answer your question, actually, the presidential memoir that I most admire and that I think a lot of people cite as a sort of great one is Ulysses S. Grant. But
personal memoirs. That's, by the way, for those who don't know, that's Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant. I think part of what makes that book so popular, it's a classic and maybe the standard, is the fact that Grant is a very strong writer. It isn't the most self-critical text. Again, the genre, and I would argue, doesn't necessarily allow for that, but it's a marvelously written text.
Right. And I think the thing that benefits from as well is the fact that it doesn't really cover his presidency, right? It's much more of a sort of war memoir, though it is written after his presidency and with the help of Mark Twain, which you could do worse for help than Mark Twain.
Yes, that's a fair point. And the other thing I think about, and I think there was a piece in The Atlantic that talked about this, some of the people who probably had the greatest capacity to write extraordinary memoirs, Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, obviously didn't have the opportunity to because of their tragic assassinations. But I often think about what those would have meant. I think, and not just presidents. I mean, I think about what a Martin King would have looked like. A couple of weeks ago, we had an episode on Malcolm X, and I wonder what Malcolm X's critical reflection would have been like had he had some distance from the extraordinary up and down of his life between 1948 and 1965 when he's killed. I think about if he had written a book in 75, right, when he had some distance from all of that and had an assessment of who he was and where he was going, what that would have looked like. And I feel like we've been robbed of some of the great memoirs of all time simply because of assassins' bullets.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think about the Malcolm X piece a lot because he would have had a different, it starts to happen at the end as he, has that sort of severing from the nation where he starts to think about that. But yeah, with the distance of 10 years or 20 years, like we could have had a lot more insights about either the sort of insular workings of that organization or about, how he understood that in a sort of analysis of power, right? And we never really get that. We're getting his feelings as he's processing them.
Right. Well, one thing we're getting, and I think we're going to get similar feelings, not of the same sort, but, a similar amount of sort of immediacy and urgency of feeling from Barack Obama's next volume, because he's writing it right now, and he's been writing it in the age of Trump. It's birtherism, allegations of him being the secret Kenyan Muslim, actually witnessing, at least, although the second volume will be about his presidency, he still has to at least account for and contend with what that means in the context of a Donald Trump presidency, right? I mean,
oh, absolutely.
I think it will be incredibly fascinating. Like you, I think I'll enjoy the second volume more than the first, but I think that this first volume is definitely worth reading. It's definitely exciting. It's definitely engaging. And even if you don't share his worldview, his politics, and even if you didn't vote for him, I think there's a lot of room to have an important engagement with the book. And I think the book gives you a window into Barack Obama's extraordinarily talented mind and his extraordinarily talented writerly projects, even, again, if we don't land in the exact same place that he may want us to. But I want to thank y'all for a great conversation. It's good to see y'all. Avisa and Justin, I know y'all are available on Instagram through the Uncle Boobies page. Nate, how can people get a hold of you through social?
You can follow me everywhere at Illuminate Mics, ILL, Illuminate, MICS, all one word.
And his book is called Finna. It is a brilliant book of poems, and he is one of the great poets of this generation. He'll be back in a couple weeks to talk about that book in detail. You coming back, right, bro?
Yes, sir.
All right, that's what I'm talking about. I'll see y'all next week, and make sure you grab the book, A Promised Land by Barack Obama. Y'all have a good week. I'll see y'all.
All right.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Avisa.
All right, thanks.
All right, bro. Peace.
Thank you for listening to Coffee and Books. Make sure to follow us on Instagram with the handle Coffee and Books Show. That's Coffee, A-N-D, Books Show. Also, you can buy all the books that I've been discussing here at bookshop.org/shop/Uncle Boobies, or you can go straight to UncleBobbies.com. That's Uncle, BOBBIES.com.